Well, thank you, John. If it's all right for me to begin, just
Yeah.
happy to be a part of the group, however remote in actuality, but through better living through chemistry, here we are in that place. Um, I was reminded not long ago about a story, an incident that happened some years ago, and I would like to share it with you because I think it's a happy thing to remember because it brings to mind some lovely people with whom we were in community when we lived in Massachusetts some years ago. Most recently, we lived in Connecticut for about 25 years, and before that, in Massachusetts. And living in an historic community populated with professional historians can be complicated as well as confusing. But then, as they say, it takes one to know one. Now, I once lived next door to a remarkable historian. Unless you were a student at the then very select New England boys prep school, Deerfield Academy in Western Massachusetts, you may not know his name. But none of his students ever forgot him or the experience of having been one of his students. He retired from teaching long before Janet and I moved into the 18th century parsonage next door to his home on the famed Deerfield Street. The street was the only name of that thoroughfare, the single mile-long thoroughfare laid out by English settlers in 1661, straight as a string, which formed the village of what is now referred to as historic or old Deerfield, Massachusetts. The person whose sweet memory I have in mind was Sheldon Howe, a lifelong New Englander, taught American history at the Academy since I think before there was an American history, in fact. I'm not sure if he was present when the Mayflower sailed from Britain, but I rather expect he may have been on Cape Cod when she first arrived. And I have no doubt that he was just outside the door of Independence Hall when the Declaration was signed, and maybe even at Lincoln's feet during the Gettysburg Address. I'm not sure about that, but somehow he missed the moon landing as he was, I think, reading late that night, or so his students would dare to tell you. He knew a great deal about history and had a wonderful way of teaching others about it as well. One of the many inventions and innovations to his teaching was a way in which he involved people doing interviews with others. It was students who had the assignment to have a face-to-face interview with some older person, someone quite senior in age, and to try to learn from them something about their experiences and their remembrances, and then combine all this into an essay and a paper of remembrance. And it was a wonderful exercise of giving an opportunity to hear and understand other people and to hear something of their experience and to try to take all this in, make sense of it, and then to commit it to writing in such a way that it could be shared with another. It was a wonderful exercise, and there are students who prize that remembrance. When Sheldon Howe retired, after, by the way, 44 years of teaching, he lived in the same town with the academy where we lived, on the street, and was himself a willing um, source for such interviews as he had devised. In other words, many students found their way to his home to ask him about his experiences. And so he was the person being interviewed as years went on. Not the only person, but one of the key people that students like to have time to spend with. I can still see him on the side porch just next door to us, rambling on about his own boyhood and adventuresome youth, hiking in the Green Mountains of Vermont, or sailing down east of Maine. He taught his son how to ski in the New England mountains, just as his father had taught him. And one of his sons, by the way, was a highly decorated member of the Alpine ski troops in Europe in the 1939-45 war. Another became a member of the Mount Washington Weather Station team, where he served some of the period during the harshest of New England winters. Now, I know that mountains in New England mean very little to people here in other parts of the country. And from my window, I can look out and see our own beloved Mount Baldy, which is 10,064 feet high, and Mount Washington in New England, in New Hampshire, is only 6,000 feet high, but it is a place where, as you may know, the most fierce, the highest winds ever recorded on the planet were at the top of Mount Washington. So Sheldon's son was very much an expert in weather and severe weather at that, and liked to talk about that as one of the things that he would report to students. So dear old Sheldon always had many good things to tell about himself and his family, and he was a great favorite of students with this kind of wonderfully creative oral history assignment that he did mete out over the years. But in time, his poor eyesight got dimmer and dimmer, his hearing less and less clear, and his lovely, dear, dear wife, Elizabeth, had to do more and more of the talking in response to the questions that the students would come to ask in their interviews. She once told me that she had gotten a little bored over the years of being just the mouthpiece for all of this, sitting at Sheldon's side and telling his story over the years, especially as she said, her family history was, if not even more rich than his, at least it was more exciting. And she wanted to weave a little bit of that in, and she did it well. Yes, she would often tell about the fact that she was, in fact, a direct descendant of not one, but four Mayflower families, countless Revolutionary War heroes, one Massachusetts governor, and directly related to two Harvard University presidents. I mean, she was a dyed-in-the-wool New Englander as well. Not just her roots, but the fact that she had a great deal to say about and memories of her own life in New England. In fact, as time went on and Sheldon rambled on about his life story, again, in response to the questions that students would ask, um, Elizabeth would add more and more aspects of her own life story into the responses. Sheldon couldn't hear this, but she tried to make his story more interesting and more alive. In fact, it wasn't unusual to have all of her story take over from time to time in the responses that she would give. And that too became a little bit boring, she once confided, just saying the same thing again and again and again. Even an exciting story, as storytellers know, can be tiresome. And so she would embellish things a little bit here, just widen the spot there and maybe add a little bit of something there. And it became more and more not only her story that she was telling, but a story that was really more story than her. Now, Elizabeth didn't get out on all of this, but she feared that she might. And one spring afternoon, Elizabeth came calling to our house in quite a state, I must say. She was most distressed. I made a cup of tea and we sat on our porch together to listen to what it was that had concerned her so. And she said that she had so much anxiety about what she had been doing. And I assured her that I'm sure that people would find it perfectly all right, that it was okay, that she had embellished the stories here and there. It was still a good exercise for the students to have to record what they had heard verbally and write it down and then present it orally. But she told me it was more than that. You see, even her story she found to be boring after a while. So she embellished that and, in fact, found characters in her own life story that she'd never heard of before. So became more and more from the fact, but more and more exciting all the time. And then it struck her that someday one of the students might come back, and lo and behold, she would forget which one she was. Now, I thought that that was not something that she should really need to worry about. And in fact, none of the students, at least as I'd ever heard, did come back to check their notes, and maybe that's a good thing. And as I think back upon all of this, I'm grateful for the fact that no one ever did. But a great many of the students over the years, I do know for a fact, did drudge their way up to Pine Brook Cemetery to pay their respectful gratitude to both Sheldon and to Elizabeth Howe in the intervening years between then and now. And for me, it is a sweet, sweet memory to recall, and one that I think of when I look at our neighborhood mountain here, Mount Baldy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That was a wonderful story. Thank you very much.
I can only imagine how the story gets convoluted.
Yeah.
Because there were
Okay,
funny
so
things
is there anybody else on Zoom that has a story they'd like to share? Adrian and Nick. Okay, let's go with Adrian first. So take yourself off of mute, Adrian. I'll replace the spotlight so you are in. There you go. Take it away.
Okay. Well, I've been working with a number of students recently and assigning them some really great American authors to read as they're kind of learning their analytical skills. And I stumbled upon a story. I love Ambrose Bierce, who wrote in the late 1800s. And I remember reading The Occurrence at Owl Creek and thinking, oh gosh, it's a really great, I mean, if he was a screenwriter in Hollywood, he'd be, famous. And then I stumbled upon another one of his stories. And I thought, I need to share this one with you. So, by the light of a tallow candle on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something in a written book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not apparently very legible because he sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light on it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity the other half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures. For besides the reader of the book, 8 other men were present, silent and motionless, and not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his side. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur, and the dead man was the only one without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in through the aperture that served for a window all the ever familiar and unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness, the long nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing thrill of tireless insects in the trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of the day, the drone of great blundering beetles. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interest in matters of no practical importance. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodmen. The person reading was a trifle different. In countenance, the man was rather with a hint of he may have assumed or cultivated as appropriate to one authority, for he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading, and it had been found among the dead man's effects in his cabin where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. And at that moment, the door was pushed open and a young man entered. He clearly was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad in those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel. He had, in fact, been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. They welcomed him into the room. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I'm sorry to have kept you," he said. I went away, not to evade your summons, but to post my newspaper account of what I suppose I am called back here to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper," he said, "differs probably from that which you will give here under oath." "That," replied the other rather hotly with a visible flush, "is as you choose. I used manifold paper and have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as part of my testimony under oath." "But," said the coroner, you say it's incredible." "That is nothing to you, sir, if it is also the truth." The coroner was silent for some moments, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently, the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We'll resume the inquest." The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn in. "What is your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker." "Age?" 27. "You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died?" "Near him." "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him at his place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction, and I sometimes write stories." "I sometimes read them," said the coroner. "Thank you," said Harker. "Stories in general, not yours." Some of the jurors laughed. "Relate the circumstances of this man's death," said the coroner. The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle and turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted to begin to read. "The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we had only one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge and that he pointed out, and we crossed it by a trail through the chaparral. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was but a few yards in advance, and suddenly we heard at a little distance to our right and in front a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see were violently agitated. We started a deer," I said, wishing I wish we had brought a rifle. Morgan, who had stopped, was watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said, "you're not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still, he did not reply, but catching sight of his face as he turned it slightly toward me, I was struck by the paleness of it. Then I understood that we had serious business on hand, and my first thought was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as well. The bushes were now quiet, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it? What the devil is it?" I asked. "That damned thing," he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural, and he trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most unexpected way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent the oats, but pressed them down, crushed them so they did not rise. And this movement was slowly prolonging itself toward us. Nothing that I have ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon. Yet I'm unable to recall any sense of fear. The apparently causeless movement of the herbage and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulder and fire both barrels at the agitated grass. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. At the same instant, I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get up on my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. May heaven in mercy spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down on one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backwards and forwards. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand, at least that I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports these extraordinary scenes, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I can't otherwise express it. And then a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. All this must have occurred within just a few seconds. But it seemed to go on and on. Yet in that time, Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident, his shouts and curses were heard as if through an enveloping uproar of such sounds of rage and fury as I've never heard before from the throat of man or beast. For a moment only, I stood irresolute. Then, throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit or some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased. But with a feeling of such terror as even these awful events had not inspired, I now saw the same mysterious movement of the wild oats, prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man toward the edge of a wood. It was only when it had reached the wood's edge that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body, altogether naked and showing in the candlelight clay-like yellow. It had, however, broad patches of bluish black. The chest and sides looked as if they'd been beaten with a bludgeon. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief which had been passed under the chin and knotted on top of the head. When the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view now repented of their curiosity and turned their faces away. Witness Harker went to the open window and leaned out across the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the handkerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped to a pile of clothing and produced one garment after another for a moment of inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed rather uninterested. They had, in truth, seen all this before, the only thing that was new to them being Harker's testimony. Gentlemen, the coroner said, we have no more evidence. I think your duty has already been explained to you, and if there's nothing you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict. The foreman rose, a tall, bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner, he said. What asylum did your last escape from? Mr. Harker, said the coroner, gravely and tranquilly, from what asylum did you escape? Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. If you have done insulting me, sir, said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, I suppose I'm at liberty to go? Yes. Harker started to leave, but paused with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, the stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned around and said, the book that you have there, I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seem greatly interested in it. You read it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would like. The book will cut no figure in this matter, replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket. All the entries in it were made before the writer's death. As Harker passed out of the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and a scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which, with various degrees of effort, everyone signed. We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits. In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having possibly a scientific value as suggestions. The book was not put into evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it was not worthwhile to confuse the jury. The date of the first of the entries mentioned was missing. The upper part of the leaf was torn away, and part of the entry remains as follows. Would run in half a circle, keeping his head turned always toward the center, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first that he had gone mad, but on returning to the house, found no other alteration in his manner than what was obviously due to fear of punishment. Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some olfactory center with images of a thing emitting them? September 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed, but just an instant, and only a few at the same time, as if something had passed along between me and the stars, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Oh, I don't like this. Several weeks' entries were missing, 3 of the leaves being torn from the book. September 27th. It's been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all of last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning, the fresh footprints were there as before. Yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It is terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they're fanciful, I'm mad already. October 3rd. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5th. I can stand it no longer. I've invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks I'm mad. October 7th. I have the solution of the problem. It came to me last night, suddenly as by revelation, how simple, how terribly, terribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They're too high or too low. I've observed a flock of blackbirds occupying the trees, and all in full song. Suddenly, in a moment, at absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not all see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command, high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. I've observed, too, the same simultaneous flight when all were silent among not only blackbirds, but other birds. And it is known to sailors that a school of whales, basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart with the convexity of the earth between them, will sometimes dive all at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded too deep for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades at the deck, who nevertheless feel its vibrations in the ship as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can see and can detect the presence of what are known as ultraviolet rays. They represent colors, integral colors in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. I am not mad. There are colors that we cannot see. And God help me, the damned thing is of such a color. And that is Ambrose Bierce's story, The Damned Thing.
Halloween.
Yes, yeah, that'd be a great Halloween story.
Yes.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Somebody come in?
I thought I'd read a lot of Bierce, but I don't think I've ever encountered that one.
No, we're having.
That I stumbled over that one just a few months ago, and I thought, oh my gosh. Yeah, I definitely have to read that one, at Halloween next time I've got a classroom of students or you guys, but I couldn't wait till Halloween because this was so good.
Yeah.
Well, his writing is so precise and
Yeah,
very impressive.
yeah.
Okay, Nick, do you want to be next?
Sure. Mine's totally different from that.
Oh, good. We could use a change of pace.
Oh, did I scare you?
Scared me.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that this one does involve death because this is the anniversary of the passing of a Civil War veteran in 1938. And the reason why I bring this up is because there were actually a number of Civil War veterans still alive here in Southern California in 1938. And in 1938, the first week of July was going to be a celebration back in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was going to be the 75th anniversary of the great battle that was there in 1863. And it had been publicly announced that because the veterans were growing older, they were in their 90s or 100s by then, this would be the last large gathering of the veterans at any public place. So it was that veterans from all over the country made arrangements to travel by train to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You didn't typically fly anywhere in 1938. It just wasn't done. I mean, if you had a lot of money, you could waste it that way, but these were men who'd already lived a long time and they didn't waste their money. Besides, the rule was that you had to take a younger relative, or if you had a spouse who was much younger, to come with you, because one of the they didn't call it memes back then, but one of the running things in the newspapers was a question of how many of these men would die at the battlefield at this anniversary. Because when you're dealing with men who are 95 or 100 years old, that's always a possibility. Well, there were several men in Pasadena, California, who were of an age and had served in the war, and some of them went back to that battlefield and some did not. One of the men who did not had actually fought at the battle in 1863, but his health was already bad. He was 94 years old and he wasn't feeling well, and it was going to be a long train trip. So it was that Edwin Frederick didn't go back there to the battle, even though if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, he was one of those men who came charging down Little Round Top. He was part of the 20th Maine, and his commander had ordered a charge. When they ran out of ammunition, they fixed their bayonets and charged down and chased the Confederates away. He knew that story, but you know, in those days, there were a lot of men with stories. And so he had wanted to go back to Gettysburg for the reunion, but he just couldn't. And so it was in late June of 1938, he passed away in Pasadena, not having gone back to be with his comrades and his friends. Fayette Nelson was the other way around, though, because he was the kind of man who served in the 1st Michigan Infantry, having enlisted early in the war, and decided that wasn't dangerous enough. So he'd gotten himself a transfer to the 1st Michigan Engineers. Now, the engineers and mechanics during the Civil War were the equivalent of combat engineers in later wars. They were the men who built bridges while they were being shot at and took things apart while they were being shot at. And it was the kind of thing where if you were an infantryman, if you were being shot at, you shot back. But if you were an engineer, your hands were full of the tools that were necessary to do something else for the other soldiers. You were building a bridge for them to cross and attack, or for them to cross and retreat. You were taking apart a railroad that the enemy was using to carry supplies, or you were helping build a railroad for your own side to get places. And so Fayette Nelson had moved over to the 1st Michigan Engineers. And that was where he served the rest of the war. His original unit had served at Gettysburg, but he still had to go there, even though he hadn't been at Gettysburg. He wanted to go back there for the anniversary. He took his daughter with him on the train going across country. And it was going to be the big event because, you see, back at the Battle of Gettysburg, there were over 100,000 soldiers there on the battlefield between the two armies, and maybe 2,000 civilians in the town and the surrounding farms. This time it was going to be the other way around. There would be about 2,000 very old soldiers and over 100,000 civilians celebrating the anniversary. It was a big deal. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was going to give the keynote address at this anniversary. The Army wanted to show off their new weapons of war, to show what it was like. And they flew soldiers over the battlefield so they could drop flowers down on places that they remembered, where they'd fought, where they'd been. But one of the officers made the mistake of asking one of the old soldiers, "So, you've seen these tanks, these planes, the machine guns? Think about what it would have been like if you'd had those here at your war." And the old soldier turned to him and said, "Yes, more men would have died."
Mhm.
The officer didn't ask any more silly questions, at least not in front of the reporters. But Fayette Nelson and his daughter got to Gettysburg, and they were there for the celebrations, for the gatherings, for the feasts, for the talks, for the demonstrations of technology. And well, it turned out that nobody died during the reunion itself. The reporters were just wondering who was going to be the first, and they were almost disappointed that none of these old soldiers died there at the battlefield. And so they went home with their obituaries unwritten. But a few of the men were told, wait a few days before you head home because it's strenuous to go across country. It's 90 degrees out here, and you've had a really exciting gathering, and it would be better to be safe than sorry. And so several of the soldiers waited there in Gettysburg under observation. And it turned out that Fayette Nelson's doctor had probably been right when he'd said, oh, you shouldn't do this. You're risking your health. Because on July 9th, 1938, 5 days after the end of the celebration, Fayette Nelson died there in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Possibly the last Civil War veteran to die where the battle took place. But I have a question for you. Was it better for Fayette Nelson to end his life after being with his fellows, the men he'd served with who'd gone on, even though he'd gone on to a different unit, but the others who'd been there in the war from different places around the country? Was that better than the way the other man ended his life comfortably at home, but not surrounded by his comrades? Both men are buried in the same cemetery out here in California. Both are in a cemetery filled with Union veterans. You see, Fayette Nelson had left word with his daughter that if he did die on the trip, he wanted to be brought back west to bury. Which man ended his life in the way that he was able to? I would say it was Fayette Nelson. If the other man had lived just a few more days or had been just a little bit healthier, I think he would have done the same thing, even if it had meant his own death at the battlefield. These things meant a lot to the men who fought in that war. And the July 4th weekend of 1863, well, they all knew that it was the turning point of the war, not as much just for Gettysburg, but the siege of Vicksburg ended that same week. The two biggest battles that were going on at the time ended within 24 hours of each other. So July 4th, for those men, had a different meaning than for most of us. It was a day of remembrance, not so much for the start of the country, but for the preservation of it. And that's part of why that trip back to Gettysburg meant so much for Fayette Nelson, and why his daughter might not have shed as many tears as you would have expected, because her father died the way he'd have wanted to, in the right place, at the right time, with the right people.
Yes, thank you, Nick.
That's a good.
Yeah. Elizabeth, do you have a story tonight?
Just a short one. I was very impressed by your story, Nick. Very impressed, and I was thinking about which one would be happier. I think the soldier that ended up here and at his life here in his home was not that the other comrades died in the field in probably cold and misery and suffering compared with him, but he had another purpose for his life that he was able to share real stories with real people all through his life, and I think he served his comrades in the battle also very much because he was able to talk about them with other people and make them aware firsthand of that particular event that, preserve a lot of things that we saw in his life when he died in the 50s or 60s, I assume. Yeah, so it is bravery in being away also. You not necessarily need to die on the fields. Okay, that was just, I wanted to tell you that. Well, I have a short story, which is kind of is a real story. And it is something a little bit historical and a little bit folklore. So it is a story about a place that I visited and experienced a long time ago when I was in college. So we are talking at least 55, 60 years ago. I am married for 51 years, so that was way before that. And so I was in a group of college students, and we were doing agricultural work. That was part of being a college student in Romania, years of 60s and 70s. So we were doing agricultural work in a agricultural area that was known for fruit trees and orchards and different fruits that need to be picked. And we decided, a group of us, 8 people, to take a short trip locally in an area that was known to be a real place, kind of sometimes a ghost a place that people said that there are ghosts wandering around there. And what it is, it was on a hill, on a valley, a river that ran through that region, and actually is the river that the current capital of Romania, Bucharest, was settled long time ago, 600 years ago. And this valley in that particular region was very narrow, very, very narrow. And back then, we are talking 1200s, there were all kinds of fights, battles, mostly with the Ottoman Empire that was in permanent pursuit of conquering the Balkans and all the little countries that were back then. So in this particular place, it was documented actually, a real fierce battle between the Romanians and the Ottomans. And our trip went on this hill that had a really big open view of that particular narrow valley. And it had like a stone rock shelf over, in which it is said that the military leader at that time was staying there on horseback on this particular rock shelf, seeing the valley, and on that rock they were the prints of the horse, 4 prints that would have been like a horse was staying there. And then aside, there were 2 footprints, like human footprints in the rock. That is said to have been the footprints of this military leader. And it happened that it was a continued battle at that time with the Ottoman Empire army, and the Romanians were conquered all the time. All the time, they were never able to win any battles, and they were kind of retreating into the woods, retreating into the mountains, but not really very successful because they could not really put together any kind of strategy to conquer the Ottoman army until they got to this particular hill. And it was so strategically arranged that the leader at that time, this person who apparently was staying horseback and watching the valley, said, you know, this had an idea. This is very narrow. I think we could block it and collect a lot of water that if we let it free, will rush over the armies, that because that valley was the only venue to go into that region, and they will move all the big boulders and will actually damage really significant the Ottoman army people. So what he did, he ordered all around in the villages in the valley to donate all their big oxen that people used to pull carts back in Romania, and also to sow the soil to plant different plants. And what he did, they kill all of those, they butcher all of those oxen, took the skins, put the skins together, sew the skins together, and make this barrage. They make this piece of, well, for a better word, and I don't find it right now, they make a barrage in the water in that very narrow valley to hold the waters back, like a dam. They make like a dam, only it was out of those oxen skins. And that was proved to be very successful. So until the army, the Ottoman army, came into that valley, following and chasing the Romanian army, then they had enough water collected behind that dam, and when they open it, the huge wave of water with the boulders and some of the woods that was ripped off the sides of the valley, and the Ottoman army was overwhelmed, and that battle was won. So they finally were able to claim victory. And all of those victories actually were for a very short time, unfortunately. And, you know, the Ottoman army was in retreat, and they had probably several good years until the next war started. Well, to thank God for this victory, the military leader at that time, the one that designed all this strategy, he decided to build a monastery. That is what they did back then. Every time a battle was won, then they would build a monastery. So they decided to build a monastery in that area. But that area, like I said in the beginning, it was just a hill, a tall hill, a high hill. And it was they were only rocks. It was very rocky. It was not really a plain surface in which you could actually build something. But what they did, they found a natural shelter that was under this huge boulder that has a shape, an oval shape, like a dome, natural dome. And underneath it is this natural shelter. And in the year it was actually documented in the chronicles, the year of 1215, They built like a hermit shelter. There were a couple of monks that went over there, males, and they were mostly hermits because it was people were not really easily to go up the hill over there. And that particular place is still available and it's still there to these days. And people are visiting. It is like a pretty intense hike and trip. You need to organize that. But it is still there and it still functions like a little church, more like a chapel. And later, 300 years later, 400 years later, in 1634, to observe and maintain the memory of this particular battle, another lord of that region in Romania built actually a real monastery somewhere in the plains to in the memory of that particular fight. So, and this was a trip that we took, and it was very fun. And I think we all, some of us are very old now. Some unfortunately passed away. We had good memories of that. So our tension and you know, discomfort that we went through being sent to all of those agricultural works, the months of September in our use, had a little bit of a fun part with this trip. That's my story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, do you have something?
No.
Okay. Oh. Avery.
I do.
Okay, that's fine.
Go for it.
Go for it.
It's fine. Let me change the spotlight.
Is it a good story?
Short story. It's a little story.
Okay.
You're gonna read to us?
Is it just a page?
Yeah, it's short.
Okay, I'm
I
gonna
don't know how much time. Yeah. we don't have.
turn it this way so that you show. And you read to both the screen and us.
Got it.
Okay, go for it.
I can't read this book. That was in. I think that's cursive. Yeah, it's in cursive. I can't read cursive. Well, then we just tell us. Tell us. Okay, so the story was about these dogs, and I don't really know much about it because I haven't really read a lot yet, but it's about like dogs and other stuff.
All right. All right, now I'd like you to move over there and I'm gonna be here because I'm gonna tell a story. Okay. Okay, now I'm in the screen.
Perfect.
So I have a short story. It's called The Old Lady in the Cave. Once there was a man who was successful in all things. He had a fine wife. He had a lovely, loving family. He had a beautiful house, and he was widely respected as a very skilled craftsman. But he was not happy. I want to know truth, he told his wife. And his wife said, well then, go seek her. And so the man turned over his house and all his belongings, put them in his wife's name. And this was something she really insisted on before he left. And then he took off in search of truth as a beggarman. And he traveled far and wide. He traveled up hills and down in valleys. He traveled through small villages and large cities. he traveled through very dry places and very lush, beautiful places. And he went seeking for days, weeks, and many months. And finally, he noticed up at the top of a mountain, there was a small cave. And he climbed up, and there was an old woman in the cave. Now, Truth was a wizened old woman, and she had only one tooth remaining in her mouth, and the skin on her face was brown like old parchment paper and just as dry. And when she raised her crippled hand to motion for him to come, she spoke in a low, melodious, and crystal clear voice that told this man that she indeed was Truth. And so he studied with her for a year and a day. And after a year and a day, and he had learned everything she had to teach him, he stood at the mouth of the cave to say goodbye and start his journey home. And he said, "You have given me so much knowledge. I would like to do something in return. Is there anything you would wish?" And the old woman tilted her head deep in thought, and then finally raised her crippled hand and said, "When you speak of me, tell them I am young and beautiful." That's the story.
And who says that isn't the truth?
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
in some ways,
Who's
yes.
to say?
Yeah.
It is truth, though.
Okay. So, let me remove my spotlight. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can talk a little bit if we want to.